welcome to this episode of Inside the Gym podcast. I'm Chris Gilbert, your host for this episode. And today we are welcoming back Tom Eilerman and Tyler Hobson. You know these guys from previous episodes, and you've heard all of their experiences. We brought them back to kind of give you a little bit of an inside and out of kind of the new school equipment versus the old school equipment. Old school equipment's become very popular. And so we wanted to dive into like, why is that old school equipment, even though it's potentially 20, 30 years old, still so popular? But before we get into that, you guys, while you're both immensely great equipment designers and creators and engineers, you both have a bit of a different style that I don't know that we fully got into when we did your individual podcasts. So would you guys mind, before you start out, with talking a little bit about how you guys differ in the way that you guys create equipment? Because you kind of brought that up to me, Tom, when we were emailing.
Yeah, I'll kind of start it out because I was on the block already for a while, and both Tyler and I have a mutual friend up in New York, Ron Norman, who we both have pieces of equipment in his home gym. And I remember seeing these pieces starting to appear in Ron's gym. I said, "Who's this Tyler guy? This young guy?" And I didn't know how old he was, and I don't know. I'll be 60. How old are you, Tyler?
I'm going to be 62 this year.
So you weren't the young kid back then. You were my peer. So I got that wrong 30 years ago. But the biggest difference between what Tyler does and I do that I've seen in our history is I design more conventional gym equipment, leg presses, benches, racks, and stuff. Because Nebula is based around an entire product line. Where Tyler, he was a focus on leverage and equipment with linkages, more like the style of flex stuff he's bringing back. So that's the biggest difference between Tyler's execution and my execution. Is he's a leverage guy with linkage. I was a little bit of everything. I became famous because Ronnie Coleman did a world record on our leg press, and that kind of catapulted us into a different world before there was social media. Mm-hmm. My motto back in the day was, I owned a gym. 6 of us that worked at Nebula were all meatheads. So we'd build a piece of equipment. We would take it to the gym. We'd train on it. We go, "Oh, this sucks. We need to change the handle or do whatever." And we would develop that after 3 or 4, renditions to being a very good piece. But, one of your questions later on is, why, what's different between equipment now and then, and we'll get into that later. But that's where I came from. I had to design an entire product line of 40 or 50 pieces that was, to facilitate an entire gym, where Tyler picked a niche and did really well at his niche. And that's my take on the difference between the two of us. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I would agree with that, in that, I was kind of, going down that path of high intensity strength training. Guys were really into strength curves and the feel of the machine. So there was a lot of cams and strength profiles being created. And what I saw and admired about Tom's world is I was a power lifter, so I knew very well about Nebula. And you had some of the greatest lifters in the world training, and they needed big, heavy duty equipment to go out there. Mr. Cohen was training on your equipment, and just real powerhouses. Versus what I was trying to get into was more of the Nautilus, MedX kind of route, where I was working with personal trainers, more in that kind of venue, athletic world, where they were doing a lot of rehab. So completely different approaches to creating tools that were going to be used by a certain population. And that population was a little bit different. And that's kind of why our styles, I think, were a little bit different.
It's funny you guys mentioned it in that manner, because I was doing a little research today on the Joneses. I saw a video where Gary was talking about how his father's equipment was very much like isolation, very much like what Tyler does. And then Gary wanted to come out with the hammer strength equipment, which was more like compound movement type of machines. more like what Tom does. So I thought it was an interesting kind of carryover from what the Joneses seem to do.
Yeah. I think the one thing that Gary Jones did, which kind of set the world on its ear in manufacturing, is he was all about manufacturing efficiencies. And so that kind of led to the demise of the one-offs, so to speak. So everything was like he was bending a certain leg a certain way, and then the engineers would sit around and go, how can we reuse that same part to be efficient uh, on a shoulder press, on a chest press? And when you start having all of these common parts that you're trying to force into a design, it dictates the design. So I think you started to see that more and more, and then everybody started spending tubing, and that kind of led down a rabbit trail, very different than what we did. Tom would make a piece because he's going to make that piece, and the next piece he would make was very different than that piece. They might not have any common parts in it, and that wasn't the intention of what we were doing. And that's how I did. I made a leg press, then I made a chest press. I didn't care if they had common parts. So the manufacturing wasn't the intent of our design.
Well, there was one thing. Here's a little tidbit of history for you guys, or trivia that most people don't know. When Tom Profit, Albert Mandel, Dave Karsten, Tom Grace were the original sales reps for Hammer before Life Fitness bought them, Profit came to me and said, look, we need platforms and dumbbell racks and stuff. We don't build that down here. He says, Gary's got 9 materials that we use, like bar stock, tubing, and rod. They only had 9 different SKUs that they would buy. So for about a year and a half, any platform or dumbbell rack or storage thing came from Nebula until the guy that Connor that owns Powerlift, when they sold to Life Fitness, that whole thing developed. I remember we had 10 booths at the Florida Coaches Show, and there's this little 10 by 10 booth, Powerlift, and we're all kind of chuckling at them like, oh, a new guy on the block, Next thing you know, this guy's he's a freaking M1 tank, and they just rolled over everybody. But that was the advantage of being part of the Life Fitness family, that Powerlift became that entity where Nebula was destined to be that, if that would have never came about.
No, that's great information, and that's a cool side bit that nobody would have known about. To get into our topic, I kind of wanted to start talking about like build quality. Do you guys notice in your experience, when you guys have touched a lot of the old school equipment, you've touched a lot of the newer stuff that's come out, is there really a big difference in the quality of the materials that used to be used in the 80s and 90s versus what's being used now? And the amount of welds and other things like that versus like the amount of pieces that are bolted together versus fully welded and things like that.
You mind if I take that one?
Yeah. I'll follow you, Tom.
Well, when both Tyler and I were getting started, I got started in '88, shortly before I was going to go back in the service. And I had a limited way of manufacturing. We cut it with a saw, we welded it together, so it's square, boxy. I'm using quarter plate, half-inch plate, just standard heavy stuff. And my school or my college and equipment, and pardon my voice to the crowds out there, I just got over the bad flu. I'm still fighting some of it, so I'm a little hoarse. But Pearl taught me to build everything overkill. He wanted everything to look like a bridge and button it with all these bolts in it to make it look like it was riveted like something on the side of a bridge. So he taught me to build heavy way more than needed to be. I mean, there's so much stuff on Nebula that could have been scaled back half the thickness and would have been just fine. But that was kind of the genre, the image that came about. But somewhere around 2000, we got our first tubing vendor, and Life Fitness is making all this elliptical pretty tubing, and they're the big guy on the block. And I was trying to aesthetically start to change the line to fit them. So we bought a tubing vendor, and all I could afford was one that bent 2-inch tubing and rod. So it was a mix of laser plate, like it's funny. I went to the same trade show that Flex did. We both came out with product with the arcs and the holes in it. And Mark and I were scratching our heads. Well, who copied who? I guess great minds think alike, Mark. And but the way I built back then and the way Tyler, we just used heavy bar stock and heavy tubing. All 11 gauge. Some of it was 7 gauge. And if you pick up a Nebula Smith machine right now, which would be what Arsenal was building, they're heavier than hell. We would use drywall carts to deliver these into the gyms to set them up because the sides are so heavy. So just because it's super heavy duty built doesn't make it the quality any better than something that's made today, because if you use correct engineering, the right amount of gusseting, tubing profiles, you can make something very light but very strong. Now, we had a conversation in my podcast about the China manufacturing, and a lot of the stuff that's being produced over in China is copies of copies of copies. So, the original design concept, like what I had or what Tyler had, and it's funny, how many times have you seen your stuff out copied by Timbuktu Company or mine? I mean, it's like, I designed stuff for Arsenal, and they just happened to see an Arch Pec fly by some company that was almost identical to what I did for Arsenal, a knockoff. I think it's an Indian company.
Yeah, I run across about 6 different of those.
And it's funny, I scratched my head and everybody, it's an Arsenal piece. But if you go back to the history, it was something that I did in the 90s with Nebula that we just refreshed and brought into a line. Mm-hmm. And, it goes to who designs in the beginning. Who's in this chair today with a new concept? Tyler and I both think differently, but we both think a lot the same. We're looking at functionality because we both train. And if you don't train, and your son, I helped Dynamic for 6 months when they were trying to take the Nebula line into the Arsenal line from 2D drawings. And they had some engineers there that came from the car companies. They came from this. They had no clue on why I had 3 handles on something or why this was done. They were just copying it, and how can we cut corners and make it cheaper? So that's where I think the biggest difference is in equipment from the 80s and 90s to now, especially if it's copies of copies of copies. It's been so watered down from the original chair or the original designer that nobody knows what the hell's going on. I'll let you take it over from there, Tyler.
I think that's a really good point. Like back in the day, when you look at the way, you and I design things, we looked at it and we came at it like too much is just enough. Right? So everything was we didn't want anything to break. We didn't want to, like you have some of these big guys like Eddie Cohn or some of these massive power lifters they're doing tremendous amounts of weight. The last thing you want on your head is that the machine broke in the middle of that. So you're overbuilding it to such a degree that it's just incredible. We also used miter cuts on everything. So we could get away with 7 gauge, and we could do, like, a lot of my stuff is 1/2 inch thick, 7 gauge. It's easier to weld. You don't burn holes in it. It's just, it's rugged, it's heavy, and there's a perception of quality to the buyer when they have something that's super heavy and they're like, oh my gosh, his chest press weighs 800 pounds. A design engineer looks at it totally different. They're like, just enough is enough. So they look at things and they look at bearing profiles and they look at things and they're like, well, a human being is not ever going to bench press over 900 pounds, without a bunch of equipment. So therefore, we only need 1-inch bearings. We don't need big bearings. They built it looking at the size of bolts even. The shear value of a 3/8-inch bolt is probably 6,000 pounds or something crazy like that. So they look at things like that and they're like, we can bring the manufacturing cost way down by doing just enough and maybe a little bit more. You can't bend 7 gauge steel very efficiently. So let's drop it down to 11 gauge or 13 gauge. We just took 4 welds out of the operation because now it's a bent system. So that's what you see over and over here. And so then they take it a step further and go, well, I already bent this part. How can we make that part work on this machine? And so they're looking for efficiencies in manufacturing, where we were looking for how do we make the best leg press? How do we make the best shoulder press? These things were not combined together. And that's a huge difference between the old school guys and today. And Tom brings up the other point. How many of these guys sitting at this desk actually even exercise? They don't know. They don't know what a strength curve is. They don't go grab a neutral grip handle and go, oh, wow, I actually didn't realize my wrist doesn't even bend that way.
Right.
You know? So they're not lifters, and they don't know until it gets out in the field, and they're very resistant to change it to improve it because it's like already in the system. So they just keep pumping out garbage.
Well, see, like right now, I'm crossing two genres here. I'm crossing the old school designer, who I've been for 40 years, and I've got a new product line, Defiant Strength, that we've got a TKO that is being made overseas, which it's unfortunate that that's the way the world is right now. But for us to do mass volume of product through a dealer network or through a direct market, we've got to get the pricing like we were building it when Tyler and I were building it. Because if you have the build cost you do today, you're going to have a $12,000 leg press, and nobody's going to want to buy it. So I've got to look at how I designed in the past. How can I scale it down aesthetically, but still be, and just like the new leg press and hack squat that we brought in the Defiant line, the Nebula Classic. I've taken a Gen 2 frame and Gen 2, basically the mechanics of the Gen 2 units, upgraded them, actually made a lot of the stuff heavier than what it was before. And to one of your questions that you give us before was bolt things together versus all welded. Well, there's reasons why I like to have certain parts of the subassembly completely welded, because you don't want any shimmy or shake to it. But also, when you're building stuff overseas, you're forced to break it down. Like my leg press used to be a solid weld wedge with a front seat. You put the two together, you put the sled on, put the seat on, you got a leg press. Okay, now if I want to get 20 of them in a container, in a small container, you break the wedge down. And see, Arsenal did that with my Gen 3 leg press right off the get-go, because it had to go through their paint line. So they couldn't run that big box wedge through there. So if you make something break down, you've got to have the sense to bolt plates behind it or weld on an extra plate, because if you're using 11 gauge or 3 millimeter tubing, and I'm going to show you an example. This is 3 millimeter tubing, which is 11 gauge. If somebody cranks the bolts down too heavy, guess what happens? It'll pull in, it'll divot it. So to solve that problem, you weld a 1/4 inch or a 3/16, or if you're talking millimeters, 6 millimeters 1/4 inch and 5 millimeters 3/16, you weld a plate on the outside to stiffen that area so you don't have that problem. But if you bolt something together correctly, it's just as solid as if you weld the frame. And now when you try to move it into a facility, you don't have to fight a doorway. Try to take an Olympic bench in, it's all welded in one T, and take it through a hallway. Like when we used to deliver at Ron Norman's house, that is the place that forced me to break the leg press down. Because you remember Ron made the special staircase at the bottom so we could get in? So
yeah. Here's the magic number: 38 inches wide.
Yep, 38 wide. That's right. Or no, it's 32 on his doorway.
Oh, 32.
The old house, the one on Old School Road, it was 30. He had a hallway and he had a door that teed off of the hallway and slightly offset his kitchen. And if you couldn't get it through a 32-inch door jamb and backed up into his kitchen, you didn't get it down the basement. And then he had to make a special door at the bottom landing because this thing went down and then went to the right. And I was the unlucky bastard that took his semi up with 5 guys, and we moved Ron out of that house to his new house he's at now. So he paid us $10,000 to move that gym from one location to the other. So I get the privilege of moving everything, including your shit, Tyler.
So the next question I had, and you already touched on it, both of you guys, when we're talking about strength curve. When I was up at Montanari Brothers, that old school gym up in Connecticut, I got a really cool opportunity to walk around with the eldest brother. I'm pretty sure his name was Rich. And one of the things he kept emphasizing when we were walking around was how, guys come into his gym with nothing but old school equipment, and they can only throw on 2 plates, and they go to the new gym with all brand new manufactured equipment down the road, and they're throwing on 5 or 6 plates. And he's like, which one's actually better? So do you guys believe there's that big of a difference in the strength curve between some of the old school stuff and the new school stuff?
There's one particular piece of Nebula that everybody calls the humbler, and that's my chest supported lever row. And it had the swivel arm and had the handles and all that on.
Yeah, I think
I had no clue what the hell I was doing in strength curves back there when I built that thing. I just built the thing with double horns on it because I like to slide the plates in like this, and the weight of all the mechanism was heavy. So if you were lucky if you were Ronnie Coleman and could put a 45 in each side and do rows, you were a big man. And it just happened to be some of the things that I did. I just built it. I had no clue what I was doing in the strength curve. That came later on in years. But I would say a lot of the stuff that I built, even like Mark Manal, I'm going to butcher up Mark's last name from Flex. Is it
Neely?
What is it?
Mark Neely.
Neely, that's it. He and I had. He was good. They were good with selectorized equipment and all the plate loaded stuff. He did phenomenal work. But he was trying to get away from that. Load like with a hammer strength where you load the plates on it, and if you don't have the pegs close to the handles, you got an ego machine where you have 6 or 7 or 8 plates loaded out here, and a guy's just going to town, all loaded up, and it's his ego. Where if you do your leverage like Tyler would do, where you have linkage arms, wherever you inject that linkage arm into, your fulcrum points are different on the arm that moves and the arm that grabs it, your movement arm. You can make that thing as light as you want or as heavy as you want, just by where you move that linkage to. So, see, my leverage was more like hammer, the stuff that people were, the Arsenal tried to do, replicate, or dynamic. Whoever took my stuff originally, and I'm not a fan of the handles they put on them, because like I blew a rotator out when I was a 400-pound bencher. And I had to relearn how to bench. I used to bench like this. Then I learned to bench like this. So the narrow grip on all my stuff was for me because I had injured shoulders. So you see that narrow grip on all the old Nebula leverage stuff. It was because I couldn't bring my elbows up. I had a bad shoulder. So, and I knew I wasn't the only guy out there that training problem. So I always had a fairly parallel or narrow grip. And when you're sitting in a chair like this, and I'm starting to move an arm down here, the handle's going to be at a really funky angle. People would go, looks like a goat, like a deer with a bunch of horns on it. Well, there's a purpose behind it. You wanted to keep a neutral grip, and anything that you design as you go through that movement, you want to keep that wrist in a neutral position. You don't want to hyperextend it one way or the other. And that was some of the things with the dynamic equipment right off the bat. I got on some of the original models, and before I even started to lift it and pinch the wrist to where it's like, you guys got to change the angles on this. And every one of my handles on the original ones had a purpose for it. And we worked that out in the gym, because you can get a machine 90% correct in the computer, but you cannot take the feel of a handle and get it perfect. You've got to go, okay, now we got to drop that 5 degrees. We got to move it forward 5 degrees, because the human body is the ultimate test of whether it fits somebody or not. Would you agree with that, Tyler?
Oh, absolutely. It never translates from the computer screen to the weight room. But one of the things that I feel that, and this has always been the way I look at things, it should be scientific in that there should be a value to the repetition. I think because I dealt a lot with athletic strength coaches versus bodybuilders, their whole job depended on, showing the coaches that they were making a difference in the weight room. And a lot of that was due to increased in strength, percentage of it increase in strength, right? So in order to actually value that, there has to be some kind of value to the repetition. And so you can't just go, okay, you know what? I had 90 pounds on the machine. Bobby's now doing 180 pounds. He's doubled his strength. Well, if that 90 pounds was actually really only a value of 30 pounds, Bobby didn't double his strength.
Right.
So these are just, I'm making it very simple, but that's the thing that a lot of guys who are just out there copying stuff, they don't actually do profiles. They don't actually know with gauges, when I put 90 pounds on there, what is the actual load on the lifter? And because of the world that I was involved in was so therapeutic and so measurable, everything they did was measurable. That was really important on my side of the water, so I had to create these strength curves that would drop off by 10% at the end for the lats and just different things like that. Nowadays, because a lot of these engineers don't even lift, they don't even know what that means. You'll see belt squats, for example, where you got guys belt squatting 1,200 pounds. That guy probably couldn't do 300 pounds in a rack. So it just becomes a big ego lift. And they're also using up all of the plates in the weight room, but it's not measurable. The strength gains are not measurable. You're doing an exercise, so there's probably still gains because you're doing a motion. And but a lot of the new stuff that you see is so skewed like that, and it might even be skewed the other way. Like the original flex incline leverage press, that was a heavy machine. If you put 45 pounds on each side, that was a load. That was way more than 90 pounds. But the big bodybuilders love that piece. But what I'm doing now is like I try to measure it, and if you've got something close to, if I have a 90-pound load, that feels like 135 pounds on a bar, for example, so that there's some kind of translation there for progressive overload.
So what you're saying basically is that a lot of it really, some of the old school stuff was kind of overbuilt from a strength curve and wasn't necessarily a true relation to the weight you were putting on the machine because the machine was so big. Whereas a lot of like good equipment designers today, not necessarily copycats, and we'll get to that in a second, are more using more measurements and more like trying to get the accurate, you put 90 pounds on, you're pushing 90 pounds because of the extra measurements they're doing that maybe not have been done in the old school. And what I'm also hearing is that whenever you're using a piece of equipment, trust that you got to know that who designed it and that it wasn't copied multiple times. Because especially with your leverage stuff, as you were saying, Tyler, that if you leverage that piece from a different spot, then that's going to change the strength curve drastically.
But you also have to look at the just the weight of the movement arms, for example. Okay, so if I make all of my equipment is made out of 7-gauge steel. It's on 1.5-inch shafting. The handles are 1.25 inch, knurled stainless steel. There's a lot of weight in just the handles. Tom's original, his leg press that he's so famous for, the size of the bearings on that sled probably weighed 200 pounds.
Yeah.
So there was a load rate. Like when I put 90 pounds on there, it was probably much more than 90 pounds versus today. We're going to go with smaller bearings. We're going to go with 13-gauge steel. The handles weigh nothing. And so when you put a light weight on there and you have a leverage advantage on top of that, your load might be a fraction of what actually is loaded on it. And that's a huge difference.
No, that makes a ton of sense. So the strength curve is definitely different, but that's not necessarily a bad thing is what I'm hearing from you guys.
No. I mean, it really depends on your target market. Like the athletic line was what we were wanting to bring out first with Defiant. We needed racks and platforms and leg presses and all that stuff. And a lot of that stuff I've done for, all my career. So it was easy to bring back certain things, make benches a little more modern looking, still from the old Nebula genre. But, I had a task in 3 years to get 40 pieces of equipment benches, and that's a big task in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm the designer, and I've got Bill, my guy that works on the other side of the wall here, that takes everything to production print. So, you know, we work together as a team, but Bill has never worked out a day of his life. He's 63, and he just takes what I give him, and he draws the prints and that, and doesn't ask questions. And I've been educating him over the last 20 months, but you know, if you're not a meathead, you don't really care why something's the way it is, you know. And
yeah, there's a big difference, I'm sure.
Yeah, so, and see, I saw that up at some of the places I worked after, you know, in Rogue and Dynamic, engineers that come from the car industry or wherever, and they didn't understand weightlifting equipment. They're just taking a model or 2D prints, and their interpretation of it, just like a lawyer interprets the law, somebody interprets your prints, and it might be a nebula piece built off nebula blueprints, but there's still things that were, you know, hand me down from our guys in assembly, the guys, because we didn't document everything. Back in the old days, you had a lot of, you know, our fab side was documented, but our assembly side wasn't. So there was no record of what bolts we were using, what bearings we were using. That was just all kind of hearsay. And, you know, like what we're doing now with the Defiant leg press and hack, the Nebula Classic series, we're using the same 1.25 inch bearings. We're using the same heavy rollers that we had underneath the sled. So you've got the same exact leg press that's 30 years old, that's brand new, and it's better. I mean, there's a lot of it that's heavier than what the Gen 2 was. And you know, the only real difference is the wedge bolts together now. The sled doesn't, other than the stainless steel weight tubes bolt into it. So you can build in this new age a mix of old school and new school. But like, look at how I set my design standards. When I send it over to our factories in China, they can't go under 3 millimeter. 3 millimeters 11 gauge, you know, and there are certain places where 11 gauge is plenty heavy, but on a movement arm, you may want to have it at trying to think, 5 millimeter, 3/16, which would be 7 gauge. There are places you want heavier, but I'm running into the problem of a particular tube that we use here stateside for our bays, our bridges. They can't get 3x8 tubing over there. There's nowhere over there that they can get it. I'm probably going to have the tubes cut here in the States and shipped over there to have them welded and painted and put back together, because there's nothing. They go, that's structural steel for buildings. I said, what do you think I got it? That's what I was using. But I think the new designers, like Tyler said, they're trying to make it pretty, and they're trying to make it as light and cheap as possible. And you put an extra 10 or 15% in material costs in each part. Now you've got an extra couple $100 in the machine. Now when you start, running that up 30% margins for the wholesaler to make, and then 30% on top of that for the dealers, that's where I had a $5,500 cost in a leg press built here in the U.S. And for us to make our money on it, and for the dealers to make money, it had to come in at $12,000 MSRP, and that just prices yourself out of the market.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
I mean, Tyler and I had this conversation on the phone a while back. I mean, he's more or less retired now, and he's doing some consulting work like I do for my day job, and he's making his signature line, having fun, doing what he wants to do, and he's having fun, so he can get up and drink his coffee, go in and drill some holes, stuff up. Like going fishing down the bayou, you can go down to the coast, whatever. And I got to sit here,
Yeah, you listen to you. Yeah, I have. It's the funnest thing when you work for yourself. It's so fun because you could listen to music, and if you feel like you want to have a beer at lunchtime, you can. And then you just go on and work another 18-hour day,
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Larry Pacifico told me one time, Tom, you're a business owner, you're going to work half a week. I said, really? How do you figure that? He goes, that's 80 hours. And I'm like, oh, 160 hours, 140 hour total hours in a week. You're going to work half of that. He was right. I mean, when you're a small business owner,
Boy, it's
or even
brutal.
a large business owner, 60 to 80 hours is nothing but work to keep the ball rolling.
Oh yeah, totally, completely. And I talk to gym owners all the time that they'll work a day job and then spend the rest of the night in their gym. So that's if that's the dream, you got to make it happen, right? But so I wanted to move on to pin loaded equipment for a second. Maybe it's the nostalgia of me, and maybe it's just the fact that I'm an equipment nerd. But I get super psyched up when I see like a piece of chain driven equipment in a gym. But it's so hard to find those, and you so rarely see them. I was in a gym a week and a half ago that had tons of old school Nautilus change-driven equipment. And when I was down at Mark's gym at Madhouse in Atlanta, he has tons of change-driven equipment. But those are so hard to find, and you just don't see them very often. Like, is there a reason that you guys think that like we can, because they feel so smooth to me and it feels so nice? Is there a reason that we went away from that nobody uses chains anymore and they all went to like cables?
Yeah, I'll take this one first. I really think, because when I was first getting into the gym equipment business, Nautilus was still big, and everything he made was super heavy. A lot of it was solid 1-inch bar stock, square bar stock.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think back then the cable technology and Kevlar belts was not available. So they only had one option to lift a heavy load, would be to use a chain. Now you roll more closer to the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and there's a little word called OSHA, or the European standards for equipment, where, if you can stick your finger in it and get it chopped off, stick your finger under a pulley and a chain, there's not really much of your finger left. So I think the chain and the pulley thing was, or I should say, were the chain driven machines, and the pulley and the Kevlar belts came when that technology was where they were able to crimp cables together with good ends. They could put those together. Body Masters was one of the first companies out there that really hit the belting, the Kevlar belting, that was when I first saw on Body Masters. And I've used both. There's machines you can use belting on. A lot of the Arsenal stuff that I did, we went to belt on. But there are certain things like cable crossovers, you got to use a cable because you're tracking through, all these different pulleys, right, like a block and tackle, and you need that. What I got right behind me, this is one of my trolleys, and you've got to take that cable through all those pulleys, and it's got to be flexible enough. That's why I use a 3/16 cable versus a 1/4-inch cable. It's got to be flexible enough. But if I had my preference between belt and cable, which this is my world, I would take belt over cable, because cable is nothing but a bunch of little cables together, and as they run over that pulley, or they're stressed at the end, those cables act like files, and that's when you start to see the lump in the black cover of the plastic, or the plastic sheath is gone, and you see the cable fraying. And most gym owners, they don't pay attention to that until somebody rolls off the back of a low row and busts their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bad thing about cables. Cables are good until they're not.
Yeah.
Belts, you can start to see them fray, and belts won't just tear because you got many layers of Kevlar in there. But you're also limited on what you can do on your rattlings. Or when you do stuff like Tyler does, or Flex did with the leverage. And actually, I'm looking at some of these new companies that China's coming out, and there's a new one. It was just launched, Monster. And I was in the lab at the factory where they were doing our multi-station, and they're set the exact machine that I saw on the internet, all launched pretty, triangle tubing and everything. And I'm just like, Tyler would love to see all the linkage on this bad boy. It was cool. I was scratching my head going, I'm taking pictures, getting ideas. And I'd never seen triangular tubing before. And then they have it's a 4-sided tubing, but it's narrow, like 2 inches at the top and 4 inches at the bottom. So they've got these crazy shaped tubes that are coming out for a different aesthetic look, but well thought out. Just like that real leader that came out, and they've got it's like hammer strength with all these extra bells and whistles to it. Tyler and I Tyler and I came from the world of simplicity. You know, we were trying to build it the best we could, as simple as possible, because you get it too complicated, you know, more things are going to break down.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, that's my comment on the pulleys and the chain. I'll let Tyler jump in if he's got anything.
Well, obviously I've done a lot of studying and I've done a lot of restoration on vintage Nautilus equipment and with the chains. It's amazing how little friction those chains actually had. That was actually shocking to me when I was starting to measure it. But really, it comes down to cost. If you want to tighten a belt on a Kevlar belt, you can simply loosen the thing, slide it through, and you're done. If you want to tighten a chain, you have to have a mechanism that has a sprocket on it, that has an idler wheel. It just was much more difficult to manufacture. The sprockets would break down and get slop in them, and then you had to tighten the chains. Or taking a link out of a chain, that's not a thing you're going to do in 5 minutes, So it just became not practical to have chains when you could do just as good of a job with the Kevlar belt, or even some of the new aircraft cables, the smaller cables that if you want to change directions, which is Tom's doing that when you're, going from a high-low pulley and you might have a push-pull on the same cable, that cable's changing directions. That's very difficult to do with the chain. So I think it's just out of practicality and just an advancement in technology kind of moved us towards cables, Kevlar belts. I think the cable technology has even taken off beyond the Kevlar belts. Now you're seeing cables that are made out of Kevlar. And so I think it's so light and you can just bend it in all different kinds of shapes without any resistance. So that's kind of seems where they're going.
Very cool. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about I kind of thought maybe it was a cost standpoint. I hadn't even thought about the safety aspect of the chains and that Tom brought up. So the next thing I want to talk about is going to so many gyms that I go to and using new school and old school equipment. I've kind of noticed that when I use a lot of old school equipment, while I love it, it doesn't generally seem to have as many different options for handle positions as a lot of the newer equipment. And it seems like a lot of the newer equipment, for instance, like the Arsenal row has 4 different handle positions, and maybe an old Body Master row has 2. And the Atlantis push piece I use has 3 different, their flat bench has 3 different handles. And the old hammer strength, it has 1 bent handle, so you can put your hand in different spots, but it's still just got really 1, maybe 2 spots, whereas some of the newer stuff has 3 or 4 different spots. Is there a reason you guys thought why that's such a trend, or is it just for versatility, or?
Why don't you take that one first, Tyler?
I would say it's customer driven. That you have all these people that if you ask somebody their opinion on something, they're going to give it to you even if it's wrong. So you got to accommodate all these crazy requests all the time. And that's the thing, that we're kind of in this, what I would call this Amazonian culture, where everybody wants all of these options, and to them options are not necessarily a value, but in the consumer's eye it is. So I've got a chest press that's got the most perfect hand position, but Tom's got a chest press that has 3 different hand positions. That's a value that the customer is looking, and they're like, oh, wow, well, this guy's got cup holders on his, I mean, so it's just kind of, that's the culture of, look at the automotive industry. You go in there to buy a car and all you want is the plain Jane version, and you come out with a full 360 backup camera and all that extra stuff just because it's just options, and that's kind of our culture right now, I think.
I do have to say the backup camera on my new car. So I would say, well, we're Tyler and I come from a training standpoint too, and like I was saying earlier, like with my Nebula leverage that I got sued from Hammer for, the reason I had multiple handles on, and the one set that was stapled through all three different chest pieces was because of my shoulder, and I knew if I had a shoulder injury, there are other more M's out there just like me that had the same problem. So, and if it felt good and I could do it, and I knew other people would appreciate that. This would be maybe the standard grip, slightly angled in like this, and it's like our shoulder press. The original Nebula had a handle here, and the narrow one's like this. I didn't even think about the change. Arsenal made a change which upgraded it a little better. They made the backrest adjustable, so now you can kind of tweak yourself in and out. You only needed one handle here instead of two, because now you can just kind of move the seat back to line yourself up with the machine. I think if I've looked at, like I'm doing a standing chest press, so I went back to the drawing board on it, and but I've looked at Dynabodies makes the one that we've all seen for 30 years out there, and it's real basic and simple, and most everybody's kind of copied that. I was telling Tyler I kind of went halfway between what he was doing and what I was wanting to do, and factory I used in China, it was too complex for me. So I'm going to go back to the drawing board and make something similar to what everybody else is doing, except the one thing I hate about is Dynabodies, when you put the handles up, the little lever falls down, you got to use your heel to dig for that thing and try to relock it up. And like all you got to do is reverse the linkage, so when it falls forward, the handle comes up like that, and when you're ready done, you step down on it. Just common sense things. But it's how many handles you need. You need a grip that's slightly off like that. You need to follow a neutral position if you're doing a conversion movement like that. As long as those handles track you throughout the movement, you're not doing any impingements on the wrist, you should be golden. And the thing is, like on a standing chest press, if you have handles up here, you're pushing up at an incline. If you push in handles in the middle, you're going to chest. And if you have them down here like that, you can get a decline position out of one machine if it's executed right. So, that's kind of my goal and what I want to design for ours, is that you can get three different movements in one machine. But if you're 6'6", you may lose, the incline because you're too tall. And if you're 5'2", you're going to lose the decline because you're too short, because you can't facilitate everybody in between 5 foot and 6'5". It's just impossible. You can make it adjustable. You can make it as functional as you can, but a seat adjustment up and down, maybe a backrest adjustment like this will take most of the body sizes in and make it work for just about at least the bulk of your clients that are out there.
Yeah, that actually leads me right into the next question. Remind me to talk to you about the Gymlico standing chest press if you haven't seen that one, because that one might be of interest to you.
What company?
The Gymlico.
Oh, Gymlico. Okay, yeah. I've been on their piece at trade shows. That one.
Yeah, their standing chest press with the adjustable up and down handles.
Well, I haven't been on that one, but I've been on like their seated decline. That thing has a really nice feel.
Okay, yeah, their standing chest press, I used it at Exile in Baltimore, and it's got adjustable up and down handles. So that way you can adjust it for your height.
There's another guy, the guy that is behind that from Sweden. There's a smart cookie. He's come back to he's using the KISS method. Keep it simple, stupid. All his equipment is so basic, but it feels really good. And of course, they're not producing it in Sweden; it's being made overseas. But everything I've seen so far, there's been a couple pieces I wasn't thrilled with, but like they probably have one of the best pendulum squats in the market. It is light. Evie Wren was at a trade show with me, and she got on it, and her and Jimmy Mentes, and they both got on it, and they've been on every single different pendulum squat, from the one I did for Arsenal to Paramount, and by far they said that was the best feel, best movement that they'd ever felt out of that one, and there was hardly anything to it. So you can over engineer something and make it too heavy, and it's too heavy.
Yeah. As far as pendulum squats, like I've used the Gymlico one and it's good. I'm still partial to the Paramount one. I think that old school Paramount one's still the best.
But think how heavy that sled is.
It's super heavy.
if you're a freshman girl in college or a freshman in high school, you're not going to do a Paralon. See, that's where Jim Rico is good, because they able to get down to that athlete that's just a young, small woman that can still do ice or piece.
Yeah, 100%. You mentioned adjustments, and that was actually the next place I wanted to go was, like when I use old school equipment, it seems like that there's usually like one adjustment, two adjustments. You can move it in, you can move it out, or you can move the back. But it seems like nowadays, especially with some of the higher end equipment, like you walk up to a piece of Panada equipment and it might take you might be able to adjust it in 7 different ways. And that's great. But to me, I feel like that's overkill. Like I don't want to go up to a piece of equipment and take 10 minutes to set it up. I want to go up and go boom, boom, and I want to be lifting. But that's me. I love old school stuff also. But what do you guys think about, like, are we going too far with adjustments, or do you think that this is really great for ergonomics and to keep people healthy and to be able to isolate things to different body sizes?
Remind me to email both of you a picture of a piece of equipment I saw at one of the factories in China. Never sold a single one. The guy paid, it was some aircraft engineered this one unit to do everything imaginable. He had $100,000 wrapped up in the prototyping of this one machine, and it looked like one of the robots from a RoboCop. I mean, from an engineer, like I was geeking out on it, but I'm like, well, what the hell is this guy thinking? It wasn't practical at all, but it did everything but make your dinner. I'll have to send you guys pictures of this. I'll have to go back and look and find it. But yeah, I think there's a point when you can do, if you give the user, especially the uneducated user, too much options, they're going to adjust it wrong every time. Like I had a simple selectorized standing calf that I did in the end. It was just a linear sled, went up and down, and had a round foot block on it. And the easiest way to adjust it was you stood on the floor, put the shoulder pads on your shoulders, got to adjust to that. Then you stepped up in the block. It was perfect for you to get a good pre-stretch and a contraction on the calves. That was all you needed on it. You didn't need shoulders and you go like this or whatever. You didn't need it. And Tyler's equipment was the same way. It was simple. I think if you give a user too much that's uneducated, you made it too complicated, and half of them aren't going to mess with it. They're just going to jump on it. Whoever set it up the last time is how they're going to do it. Would you agree with that, Tyler?
Yeah, I think when you talk about adjustments on machines, there's 2 different avenues. When they have adjustments to make one machine do something else,
right,
or multiple things, like, oh, this is a incline machine. It can also do flat. It can do overhead. It can do all these things. It becomes very confusing, but you'll always sacrifice on 1 or 2 of the movements to capture the extra 2 or 3. You know what I mean? So it's going to be a really good, it's going to feel good in the flat chest, but it's not going to feel good in the overhead because there's a little bit of a different movement and a different strength curve. But when you watch people try to figure that out, and there's not a book and there's not a trainer there to help them, it's just confusing versus just jumping on a machine that's designed. I can move the seat up and down or the seat back, and I'm going because I got to get to work. I don't have time to sit here and play with this thing for 20 minutes to get it to fit me just right. But I think that some of the older machines didn't have enough adjustments on them. You look at some of the old Nautilus machines. That was the complaint. It could fit one size person and not anybody else. It didn't have enough adjustment. But now I see machines. Again, it's typically when it's trying to do multiple functions. That's when they get confused.
Yeah, especially like some of those chest presses that go from flat to incline to shoulder press, and like you can get a lot of adjustments.
Exactly.
See, I mean, when I first come out with my leverage that I got sued for, we had the impact plungers, and this is what Arsenal's build now is we had the impact plungers that would adjust up and down. And, that because that was a complaint with hammer strength is, you had to stretch way out here. You hurt your back trying to get it, or you needed a spotter to get started. And, later on in later designs, it's just you make the seat move so you can go in a little closer to the movement arm, and it's a little simpler to move you towards the arm than, or Atlantis did it the best, and they put a movement arm down here with the plate stacked on. They had the arm that you had the handles on up here, and they had a pop pin between it. So if you needed to adjust the handle, you popped it like this. With mine, you had to lift it up, lift this up. You might have 3 plates on it. You need to have it adjusted wrong. It was a pain in the ass to do. Where Atlantis's version of what I did was they had a pop pin. You just moved the moving arm. The arms with the weights on were sitting on a dead stop, and away you go. So, everybody looks at it, how I looked at it 25 years ago, and then I see it now like, oh, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, I think that there are some pieces out there that do multiple functions that work really well. Like I love the Atlantis like chest press. It also does decline. And it's super easy to figure out. It's super easy to transition it back and forth. It works really well on both sides. But then like I was just at a gym that has the hammer strength seated chest press with the lat pull down on the other side. And I love both of those pieces by themselves. But when they were combined, it just didn't feel the same on either side. So I think sometimes it works really well. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily work as well.
Yeah. Tyler, he stated it earlier. I mean, you sacrifice part of the movement to incorporate another movement with one leverage arm.
Right. Yeah, 100%. The last question I have for you guys was, in talking to a lot of gym owners, the biggest complaint I hear constantly is lead times. And in talking to you guys, and then in my chat with Tom Kenny, Tom Kenny was telling me, back in the 80s and 90s, like you guys were cranking out entire gyms in like 12 weeks. And now, if you want a piece of prime equipment, it's like 18 months maybe. Like what's going on with that? Like, do you guys have a thought or a theory as to like why is it taking a year to get a new piece of equipment when you guys in the 80s and 90s were cranking out entire gyms in 12 weeks?
I don't think we had the volume of sales that we had back then either. I mean, I remember, I was pretty close to the guys at Body Masters, and I actually almost hired one of their crazy sales reps, which that's a whole nother podcast in itself. But if you did $20 million in 1 year, you were a big company back then. So the average company was going $4, $5, $6 million a year, and that seemed like a big number. I mean, I was doing $2.5 million a year, and we had 30 employees, but we could handle it. And my last year in business as a small operation, we had 5 of us, and we did $978 million, just shy of like 1 million by like $13,000. And we were able to build $1 million worth of equipment. And I had 30 employees when I was doing $2.5 million. So one, I saw how inefficient my factory, the old factory, was, and how we got to the newer version of things. But I don't think we had the volume of sales. I mean, now you've got social media, it's worldwide. Everybody wants a prime piece or an arsenal piece. They want it now. And a factory they've got 3 shifts working. They've got so many employees, and they can only put out so much product per shift. And if you outsell that by 3, 6, 8, 10 months, a year, it's just, unless they want to add people, which is overhead, that increases the overhead, that increases the cost of your equipment. So they're working with the size machine they got to put out as much as they can in that time. And that's why a lot of the companies are subbing their work out to China, because these factories I was in, like I told you in my podcast, they're state of the art. The most sophisticated robotic welding, the most sophisticated tube benders, the most sophisticated, newest tube lasers. I mean, they build this one widget, and the 1,000th piece coming off that robot weld cell is exactly, you could put it in any machine and it fits the same. We didn't have those qualities. I mean, we were a fab shop. We had weld fixtures, but our accuracy wasn't that good. So, if we needed to put out $5 million of equipment, we would have upsized and did what we had to do. But there's a point in time when you're getting $20 million a month worth of orders in, you can't scale up that fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other huge impact that I know I'm benefiting from this is that there's a global economy now that we didn't experience before, and Tom touched on social media and e-commerce and things like that. So when you look at Prime, I know for a fact, because I sell to some of the same people, you got people in South Korea that are purchasing, you know, 4 and 5 ocean containers full of Prime equipment. And then you've got people in the UK that, Staff's Fitness, that are buying, you know, ocean containers filled 80 to 120 machines a month. And then you go into the Middle East and the Europe, saying, and like Tom said, you can only put out so much from one location. What's odd is, do you still keep, at what point do you stop taking the orders?
Right.
Like when you have a guy that's like, okay, you can't buy my Harley Davidson, you have to be on a 5-year waiting list. At what point do the customers get discouraged and look elsewhere, to other venues? And that's kind of what's happening right now. But the fact that you can create this global commerce right now without even advertising is something that we did not deal with back in the day at all.
Yeah. And the other thing is, that's probably another reason why the used equipment markets went flipping crazy, because I had my entire barn here downstairs is full of old Nebula. Well, it wasn't old. It was never finished. And when I finished, it was brand new Nebula equipment. I sold it for the retail price I had set in 2010, and I ended up getting 2 guys to buy it all. But if I'd have that right now, I could get 3 times the money that we sold retail for, because people wanted it, and they can't
Mhm.
get it. And I mean, prime example, my 30-year-old leg press, rusty and a piece of shit, will bring $6,000 to $10,000 overseas because they can't get it. But see, that's going to change tides before long, because when they realize they can buy that Gen 2 leg press now, that's better than the 30-year-old one for $6,000 or so, then they're going to look and go, okay, well, that's going to bring some of that inflated pricing down. I mean, look at the Flex stuff that you're copying and bringing back now. I mean, $6,000 and $8,000 for a 20, 30-year-old piece of equipment, and it doesn't even have to be painted in good shape,
Yeah. Yeah. I know you're friends with David Scott. Him and I talk a decent amount about the price of equipment, and just like, because he's got tons of old school equipment, and he'll occasionally tell me, he's like, yeah, I just, like, somebody offered me like $8,000 for this piece that, 5 years ago I paid $500 for. So it's gotten pretty crazy.
Oh, speaking of David Scott, Hybrid Gym, he's got a lot of my stuff. He's got some of Tyler's. He's the madhouse of the North. I remember I used to train with David, a couple times a week, and in the old, it was a tobacco barn, 7,000 square foot tobacco barn. It had a lot of character, but you had to watch him walk down the middle, because they had this raised floor. You'd trip and fall down, and he went. He showed me the building. He goes, "What do you think of this?" And he was looking at the canning factory he's at now. I'm like, "How much do they want to charge?" I said, "Man, that's pretty cheap." So he jumped from 7,000 square foot to 22,000 square foot, and I think he had under 500 members, and he's around 1,000 members now, and it just keeps growing.
And he's doing a great job. But he does a great job also. I mean, that's one of the things for any gym owners out there that are watching this podcast. Like there are plenty of examples out there of gym owners that are doing a great job for you to pay attention to and learn how to do it the right way.
I mean, that's my favorite thing when I scroll through social media. I like to see what these other gym owners are doing, because there's a lot of hard-working blue-collar gyms out there that are just, like Tyler said, the guy, or you said, the guy have a day job. David used to be a nurse. He got to the point where he had to be there, and he gave up being a full-time nurse, full-time running this gym, and he's glad he did. I mean, he doesn't miss the politics of being the head nurse, but I kind of missed that paycheck on top of what I was making a hybrid. But for him to make that business go, he had to finally make that decision that got to give up the career, and I've got to make the gym my career.
Yeah. As far as equipment goes, like new school and old school, is there anything else you guys think that we didn't touch on, or anything else you guys wanted to elaborate on at all before we sign off and say sayonara on this episode?
I'd say the only thing we really didn't cover, but we mentioned, was the fact that if a design has been copied from the original design chair over and over by, guy sees a picture in India, like the syndicate, you see those guys go live with the gym equipment syndicate all the time, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, those guys are like designing stuff every 3 days, but you'll see them copy what you do or what was done, and they miss the subtle points that Tyler or I or the designer would have put into that made it a great piece of equipment. They miss, they roll right over that handle or that feel, so just because it's a copy doesn't mean it's as good. And sometimes even the originals aren't as good, and somebody can take that original idea and improve on it. So it's not always a bad thing for something to be copied, but it just depends on who's doing the copy. And if they're just trying to do a mimeograph copy, and every time you copy it, it gets a little grayer and a little shittier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, don't copy my mistakes.
Yeah, go ahead and copy my mistake.
Yeah.
Works.
Yeah, I've used plenty of copies of machines that I was like, this one didn't work. And I've used plenty of copies of machines and I'm like, okay, this is a really good this is a really good replica of what this machine was meant to be. And I've used a couple that I'm like, this feels a little better than the original did.
The one I see at Tyler's copied the most is your squat with the floating shoulder pads.
Oh yeah, gosh, that's a 30-year-old design, and I mean I've seen that in every single country across the world.
Yeah. It's just like the poor guy that's bringing back Body Masters that came up with a glutenator, and that thing's been taken overseas and copied. And I know who had part in doing that, so I'm not going to mention that in the podcast, but it's just like, as soon as they get it over, you can patent it in the United States, but if you don't patent it in China and have the ability to have the legal resources to defend that, I actually saw the new bench that I designed for Defiant. I seen this Vista. This company's been all over Facebook here recently, and my God, it's my bench that I just got done designing. We launched or a copied version of it, because I know I've never seen the foot with handle before. I made that, and here I see this bench. I'm like, okay, did they see it, or did that factory release it out?
Yeah, that always stings, man. It always stings.
Oh, yeah. Oh, one more question, because I just thought of this, and I wish I'd put it in the original. One of the things I really miss about old school equipment that I don't see anymore, because you mentioned handles or foot, is a lot of the old school pin-loaded equipment had that foot piece that would bring the handles out for you, and you just don't see that anymore. You think that went away from a cost standpoint, a safety standpoint? Like,
look at all the new Pinata equipment; it all has it on it. It just depends on. I got some product that I'm doing that I'm going to put it on, because it's a lot easier to come. You start a movement instead of down here. You start up here, your strength curve. You get that. Once you get that first rep up, it's easy to do this.
yeah.
So it's something that I'm incorporating some leverage that I'm working on, but I don't think it's a cost thing. It's just, do they want to make it like a piece of hammer strength where you sit down and you grab the arms and you go? Because when you add that extra linkage, it's an extra cost. But it also can, like my pec fly I did, before. It needed a foot lever, because it would really been nice to get those handles up here instead of starting down at the bottom like this. So
it's a $500 option on my upright chest machine right now, so there is a cost.
Oh yeah,
but it's an optional thing for those that want to get it. If I talk about it and tell them, hey, this is an option, everybody that I tell, they actually get it every single time. But it is an extra $500. It's the whole bottom of the machine has to be completely built different to accommodate it.
Yep.
So that's probably the reason it's gone away, is just because it's such an expensive thing to put on a machine for for something that adds value, but doesn't really change the way the machine like functions as far as like pushing weight.
Well, like Tom said, if you look at a company like Panada, they don't blanket their price tags, and they're not for everybody. That's probably one of the priciest brands I would think
Oh,
out
100%.
there. You know, there's Jim 80 and Jim Lico, and you know, those are not cheap brands. But you know, when people see the value in little widgets like that, they'll pay for it.
Yeah.
And it's just, if you're working out by yourself and you can train heavy, you really need that lever to get it up so you can actually get it out of the bottom. Because I mean, try to throw up a pair of 100-pound dumbbells. I watch Leo train, and he has guys helping him when he's in the 150-pound range. You can't go here and start. You need to start up here. Once you start the movement, it's easy to but to go dead out of the basement like that, it's not possible.
Yeah.
So, from an engineering standpoint, just the functionality of the body and how it functions, that's actually a very important feature to leave out in some machines.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. Yeah, I missed that in a lot of the newer pieces. That I love that in a lot of the older pieces. But I didn't have any other questions. I really appreciate you guys coming on and taking this time and enjoy this conversation about old school and new school. And I look forward to hopefully having you guys back on, and we'll get some more conversations going in the future.
Hey,
Tom, it's good to see you. Thank you, Chris.
Good to see you, Tyler, and everybody out there. Hope you enjoyed our podcast.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more great content.